Okay. I'm just going to miss the first couple of thoughts that I had. All right. So we're going to start off with 3 reasons why the English came to the New World. All right. And these 3 reasons are the same reasons that the Spanish and the Portuguese had all these other European countries when they were coming over here to the Americas. Okay. Number 1, they wanted to make money. Okay. Initially, these early, explorers, what were they searching for specifically? Think about Pocahontas and they get off the boat and the gold, right? They're searching for gold. They find much gold? Nope, they didn't find much gold. Okay, so the French, what did they turn to? We talked about this a couple days ago. How did they make money in the New World? Fur, right? Fur trade. And they made, a lot of money there. They made bank, better than gold. Okay. Well, the English, they didn't get too involved in the fur trades. They actually went the agricultural route. Okay, and they made a lot of money with the agricultural products that they were growing in the colony. And it started off with, does anybody know what 2 agricultural products grew quite a bit in the colonies? Tobacco was one of them. Wheat's more Middle East, and then later on, yep, cotton. All right, tobacco and cotton. These are very labor-intensive type of agricultural products. They don't have the machinery that we have today to make it a little bit easier to mass produce these products. So you've got to have some slave labor, so that's creating the demand there. Another reason why the English came to the New World, political freedoms, and then religious freedoms, the third one. Okay, you think about the Pilgrims, right? They didn't like the idea that they were growing up in a cultural environment where their children in Europe could be exposed to other type of norms and beliefs that they didn't necessarily agree with, and so they wanted to create something on their own. Essentially, they wanted to create a perfect society here in the United States. What eventually later became the United States was the 13 colonies, a utopian type of colony. That's what Massachusetts Bay Colony was thought of as, a light upon a hill, to shine back to Europe, to teach all those people back in Europe what life should be like. Okay. Ironically, what they left, Europe to try to acquire with the political and religious freedoms, ironically, those are the things that were kind of exploited with this addition of slave labor, right? Religious, political freedoms for slaves didn't really happen at all, okay? So why did they eventually get to slave labor? Because initially, these English colonists, they didn't use slave labor. Right? The English colonists, they used white indentured servitude, or servants, white indentured servants from Europe. Okay, they didn't use slave labor initially like the other European colonists did in the Caribbean or in other parts of Latin America, like down in Brazil. It was really about economics. It's about supply and demand. Okay. When England finally entered the slave trade, they were one of the last ones to get back involved in the slave trade. For the southern plantation owner, the supply of African slaves, it went up so much that the price dipped below that of an indentured servant. So it was just cheaper for the southern plantation owner to purchase an African slave rather than a white indentured servant from Europe. Okay? And then, in addition to that, the supply of white indentured servants was going down, making the price go where? Up. It was becoming more and more expensive. Okay? So, what they started to do was they started to justify enslaving Africans because of what? They were saving what? Money. It's really about economics. They were saving money. It was a cheaper product for them to purchase. Okay? So, in this whole process, what I want you to think about is this concept of ideal versus real culture, right? Remember we looked at this at the very beginning of the fall semester, 2 different types of culture. Ideal culture is what we like to think is what happens, but then there's real culture is what actually happens. When we think back to our early founding fathers of the American Constitution, a lot of times we have this skewed viewpoint that these guys are awesome, right? Think about Thomas Jefferson, right? He was reflected in the text with race. He wrote the Declaration of Independence, and all the stuff that he's writing down in there about human rights and, these qualities and freedoms that each one of this is revolutionary stuff. This is really good stuff. But at the same time, what's going on outside of his window? Enslaving people. He's taking all those things that he's writing down, he's taking all of those things away from a particular group of people. Okay? So you've got this ideal and then real. It's completely different here. So ideally, the English colonies were supposed to be a utopian, a perfect society for political and religious freedom and opportunity. But realistically, the English colonies became a social environment ripe with discrimination that makes one contemplate human progress. Okay? I mean, think about other time periods in history outside of the United States that we think about where people have been exploited and people have been abused, murdered, killed, those types of situations. What comes to mind? Like these human atrocities. You would think of what? You would think of the Holocaust, right? Maybe we think about apartheid that we talked about last fall from South Africa, okay? And all those perverse feelings, those disgusting feelings that are kind of associated with those things. When we look at that, do we even think about those things when we think about American history? We don't equate those things, right? So it's kind of like we get so caught up in this ideal culture thing that we miss we get the blinders on when it comes to the reality of what was going on with the slave trade. Okay, as the number of Africans increased, lawmakers began to create legal codes to restrict slave activity, and this is a part of that dehumanization process. Okay, initially, I want to make sure that you guys are aware of this. Initially, when these African slaves began to start replacing the white indentured servants, the African slaves were given the same rights as these white indentured servants. Everybody got that? So the rights of the white indentured servant included education, included the ability to be a part of the community, included the idea that you could have a family and procreate. Okay? Those were the rules and rights, just like you had aspects of slavery in the past. But whenever the number of African slaves started to increase quite a bit, all these rights started to disappear. And then you had this process of dehumanization starting to take over, right? Why do you think that is? It really goes back to one thing. It was a misconception that we talked about on Wednesday. What did Europeans think of the cultures of Africa? They thought that they were what? Uncivilized, right? That stereotype, that was created by the Europeans. A few of the Europeans started to run rampant, right? And it spread everywhere. If you were English, Spanish, Portuguese, that idea, that stereotype began to progress, and then all of a sudden you start to have the dehumanization process taking place with this taking away of the rights. Okay. So one misconception leads to an exponential separation between racial groups. Okay. So why all the rules against those of African origins? The larger the slave plantation, the greater the danger to white society. Because essentially, what are you doing if you are enslaving a person? You're taking away all these human rights. You're mistreating them on a regular basis. A lot of times you have to use fear to suppress an uprising. So you're very forceful in the behavior on the day-to-day basis of what you're doing to the enslaved population. It says for each colonist who purchased a slave, he or she also purchased a potential insurrectionist. A slaveholder had to live a life of fear, the consequences for placing wealth above all else. Right? So imagine what that slaveholder would do. Okay, he's got his own family, right? And he's got a large number of slaves because he's working on this southern plantation owner and he grows cotton, right? Imagine what he would do to protect his family there, right? Because his mind is distorted with all these fears, right? Stereotypes associated with these negative characteristics of people that come from African origins, right? So, I mean, what extremes is he going to go to, right? It's going to lead to some extreme, behavior against the enslaved population there, okay? There's an interesting statistic when you think about the dehumanization and the relationship between the English colonists and the slave population, the African slave population. When you would have fewer slaves, say for example like the ratio would be 5 English colonists to 1 slave, 1 African slave, and this is predominantly in the region of New England. When the ratio was 5 to 1, you would have less dehumanization, right? Less dehumanization, less discrimination, less aspects of racism and the cultural environment that we have today, okay? But when you would have a higher slave density, 1 slave plantation owner to 5 African slaves, so it flips, the ratio flips, you have an increase in this idea of dehumanization, okay? Maybe that's why I was disillusioned whenever I went through school. My teachers taught me about racism, and they said we got it solved, and talked a lot about equality and treating each other, as if everybody's got the same freedoms and opportunities, and everybody's got the same rights, right? I had an eye-opening experience. I went to school in Tennessee, and so Illinois would be one of the Union states in the Civil War, right? And then Tennessee would be a Southern Confederate state. And the first time I went to Tennessee, I was in high school at the time when I went there. It wasn't like I had to sit down and have a conversation about somebody about the history of Tennessee, right? It was just, you got a feeling. You just got out of your car and you started hanging out with, I went down to some camps down there, and just the guys that I hung around with, you just got a feeling that there was just racism, right? It wasn't the same feeling as what I had when I hung around the guys when I was going to school in Illinois, right? It was a completely different context. It's the things that they said, the innuendo that they would have in their conversation with one another. It was like, I can't believe this stuff is still happening. But that's a result of really this, right? The ratio. This is a quote. You don't necessarily write this down, but one Englishman in the 1700s, it was in Jamaica, and it would be in the Caribbean. The planters do not want to be told that their African slaves are human creatures. If they believe them to be the humankind, they cannot regard them as no better than dogs or horses. So you can see the fulfillment of the dehumanization there, okay? What began as a stereotype, again, we kind of reiterated this already or talked about this, as a stereotype of the culture of Africa, it grew into stark prejudice. Many English colonists could only see the false stereotype of the African slave, and the African slaves were not given the opportunity to prove to the English colonists anything but that stereotype. They couldn't get past that stereotype. All right, we got just a couple more things, and this is kind of like one of the most important aspects, right? So if you haven't written anything down, make sure you do get this stuff written down, okay? So again, we're going back to that question of why do we as the United States have issues with race today while other places in, say, Latin America or even Canada, they don't have issues, right? One of the reasons is one's belief system, right? Latin America is pretty much colonized by Spain and by Portugal, and then you had the French in Canada for an extended period of time. All of those cultures have a strong relationship with the Roman Church, right? With Catholicism. Right? If you're familiar with Roman Catholicism, there's a bureaucracy with Roman Catholicism. There's a hierarchy. Who's at the top of the Roman Church? The Pope, right? And so you have like power delegated down all the way into who's the main medium between the Roman Church and the populace? That would be a Catholic priest, right? Okay, and so they are, employed by the Roman Church, and they are sent out, and they're, in this particular case, they're sent out to save a lot of people, save souls, right? So we'll talk about that here in just a little bit more, okay? North America, though, they're Protestant. The majority of the English, they separated themselves from the Roman Church. They have this Protestant type of mentality, so they have more of these like preachers. They have less of them, and that consequently has an effect on race relations a little bit later on. The other thing that Portugal and Spain has is authoritarian rule, meaning they have a monarch, they have a king. Okay, so if you're a plantation owner in Latin America and you do something wrong to an extreme where you exploit these slaves to a great extreme, you have somebody that's over top of you that's going to hold you accountable. You're going to get in trouble, right? In this newfound democracy that they have in the colonies, right, there's less unification. If you're a southern plantation owner, is there really anybody above you that's going to say, you're in trouble for what you're doing with your slaves? There's nobody there. Right? Does everybody understand the difference there? Right? This democracy thing was very new in England, or in the English colonies. So there was no really authoritarian type of rule. In Latin America, they wholeheartedly sent clergy or priests to the New World. Their purpose was to convert Amerindians and African slaves to Catholicism, okay, to Christianity. So, if you think about that for a second, if they are going to try to convert African slaves and Amerindians to Christianity, what do they have to have in order for them to have this conversion? They have to have begins with an S. They have to have a soul. Right? The idea is that they have a soul worth saving if they're going to send out these priests to reach out to the African slave population and out to the Amerindian population. They're trying to save their soul, okay? If they're trying to save their soul, then what does that mean about their sense of humanity? Are they more likely to be seen as human beings, or are they less likely to be seen as human beings? They are more likely to be seen as human beings, right? If they're willing to try to convert them to Catholicism, they're more likely to see them as human beings who have less discrimination. Everybody see that? Right? In North America, they only had these Protestant preachers, right? And they weren't in large supply. So it wasn't like you had these Protestant preachers going out to the Amerindians or going out to the African slave population and trying to convert them, right? So if you didn't try to convert them, then they were less likely to see the African slaves as having souls, or the Amerindians as having souls. No souls, then they were not considered to be what? Or less likely to be considered what? Human. Right? So does everybody see how faith and the belief system, the difference between Catholicism and Protestantism, is a big factor in race relations today? Right? So race relations are better in Latin American environments than what they are in the United States, based off of Protestantism versus Catholicism. Okay? One last factor, and I mentioned this the other day as well. When the Portuguese and the Spanish, when they sent these colonizers over to the Americas, they didn't send them in masses like the English did. Okay? There was only a smaller number of Spanish and Portuguese, and most of them happened to be male. So, since there was a smaller number of them, they didn't bring a whole bunch of skilled artisans like blacksmiths, right? And people that would like build houses and stuff, right? So there was a less number of skilled artisans. So what do you have to do if you're in that context? You have to depend upon other people that are there to fulfill these roles. So that would be those of African origins. Right? They could develop the skills that would contradict the stereotypes, the negative stereotypes associated with African slaves. Or it could be Amerindians that could develop these skilled artisans as well. Right? And if you're likely to depend upon these skilled artisans that happen to be of African origins or of Amerindian origins, what's going to happen to your perception of them as a particular race, as a group? Is it going to improve or is it going to decrease? It's going to improve inevitably, right? You're more likely to see them as human beings, okay? The other thing, There's a less number of mates, meaning fewer Spanish women, fewer Spanish or Portuguese women came over to the Americas. So what does that mean for the males, for the Spanish and the Portuguese? When they get to the Americas, they're more likely to procreate, have families with the African population or of the Amerindian population. Okay? If you're more likely to have families with them, you're more likely to see them as human beings. Okay? With the English women came with them. And since the English women came with them, and they came with masses, so they had their own skilled artisans, did they need to depend upon the African slaves for this, to fulfill those needs? They didn't, right? And they didn't procreate with the African slave population like the Portuguese and the Spanish did. Okay? Less interaction, more separation, more discrimination, more prejudice, more racism, inevitably generations later on down the road. Sound good? All right. So sometimes when we think about racism today in the world in which we live, we just think it is the way it is, right? It's always been that way. We don't really have an understanding of where it came from. These are huge factors that contribute to these aspects of racism in the world today. Anybody have any questions before we finish? Nope. All right. I appreciate your attention. I know that was a lot of stuff this morning. Hopefully you were able to gain something from it. All right, we got a few minutes left of class. You guys can read from Race for the last few moments, and we'll get 3 questions here, okay?